Hey guys, sorry for the quiet audio in the last one. That's all right. I'm gonna pick up where I left off, and this is gonna be two videos. I had some technical difficulties. No big deal. We're picking up, sort of talking about General Lee, a little bit of background on him. Like I said, his ancestors came from England, and they were supporters of King Charles against the Parliamentary Army in the English Civil War. The Parliamentary Army was successful, and these followers of the king who saw themselves as knights and followed the code of chivalry, they referred to themselves as cavaliers, which interestingly is why the University of Virginia, their mascot is the Cavaliers. It's named after these guys who left England, and what they ended up doing in Virginia was essentially sort of trying to establish a new aristocracy based on sort of the system in England, and I feel like in a lot of ways they did. If you look at plantations and think about them as manors and the sort of feudal serfdom and slavery, there's a lot of overlap there, which I think is particularly interesting. But they fought in the American Revolution. Lee's father was an American Revolutionary hero, cavalry officer who had a lot of success fighting against the redcoats. So he was famous, but he made a lot of bad financial decisions after the war, and ultimately sort of died in poverty. Lee did not own any slaves. He didn't come from a slave owning family. In fact, he was not particularly wealthy. He got into West Point because of the reputation of his father. He was admitted. He actually graduated, I believe, second in his class. It's either first or second. I should be able to remember these things, but I don't entirely. And he went on to be a famous. He was in the engineer battalion. He did a good job as an engineer, but it's hard to become famous as a general as an engineer. You're like your job is building bridges and building fortifications and things like that. But he went down to the Mexican War, and he was assigned to Winfield Scott, who was a commanding general. The two of them became very close friends, and Scott began to rely more and more on Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee often volunteered for dangerous scouting missions. In fact, he had one horribly dangerous scouting mission where he went off alone to try and find a way to flank a Mexican army position, and he ended up at this watering hole. And he was moving along, and all of a sudden he heard Spanish being spoken, and he hid behind this log, and this entire battalion of Mexican troops, not even a stone's throw from him, all came down to drink water from this watering hole, and he had to hide there. He actually had to stay down there all day, he got a couple scorpion bites, and like things were pretty bad for him. But he couldn't say a word, he couldn't do anything. He ended up reporting back to General Scott, and they had found their flanking way around the enemy. It was the way the enemy was coming down to the watering hole, and so he then led Scott's forces back, and they were successful. And there are lots of stories like this about Lee in that war. It was his big break. At the end of it, he was assigned to General Winfield Scott as one of his aides. So was McClellan, by the way. So the two of them knew each other very well. Again, I was talking about his sort of aristocratic sense of humor. He liked to sort of laugh at Hooker and Sedgwick and make fun of them. As with all of his opponents, he did not have a high opinion of the Union officer corps. As well, he might not, having been able to beat them so many times. This also allowed him to take some risks, like dividing his army in the force of a numerically superior enemy, and things like that. Enough on Lee. Well, no, that's not enough on Lee, really, because after he came back from the Mexican-American War, he became the commandant of West Point. And I think this is interesting, too, because he ended up being the guy who saw a lot of the officers of the war while they were still essentially uh, students underneath him. We're going to see a guy named Jeb Stewart today, who was one of the guys that he saw all the way through West Point. So he also, very interestingly, was the commanding officer who put down the, I don't want to call it rebellion, put down the Harper's Ferry incident. You guys remember when Smith came in and tried to, take over Harper's Ferry and take all the weapons and take them down for a slave uprising that was going to end that part of the war, and the United States Army put it down. It was Robert E. Lee who commanded that affair. I think that's interesting. We all know Stonewall Jackson. He is still with Lee at this point. He is his second in command. And he is actually going to take a larger force than Lee. Lee is going to stay behind with, I believe, 17,000 men, 15,000 men. And Jackson is going to take 33,000 men on a flanking march around the enemy. And then our third guy is Jubal Early, who is the guy who's left behind to defend Fredericksburg with 12,000 men. Jubal Early is an interesting figure. Not a very nice guy by all accounts, but he did go to West Point and graduate. He fought in the Seminole War, but he did not fight in the Mexican War. He gave up his commission to go into politics. A very ambitious guy. But when the war started, he felt like he had to rejoin. He rejoined the Confederate Army and rose up through the ranks until eventually he became a corps commander. A relatively good tactician. And somebody who was good at logistics and organizing and all that kind of stuff. Lee had some good trust in him. So that's Jubal Early. And then I already mentioned how Longstreet, the probably best defensive general that Lee had, was not in this battle because he was off south trying to get supplies for the Southern Army, which was starving. It says something, by the way, about the logistics, and we looked a little bit at the beginning about, like railroads and the power of each side to provide for the armies. And the North did a really good job of shipping supplies and food to its armies, and the South did not. The logistics were non-existent. They didn't get reinforcements. They didn't get ammunition. A lot of what they had, they actually got from winning battles and taking from the dead guys, or from prisoners. So, you can sort of see that here with the way that Lee had to weaken his forces so that his guys would have stuff to eat. All right, so Chancellorsville, as I said earlier, it's not a town. It was a house. The house served as an inn for travelers because it was between Fredericksburg and Culpeper. There was one family who lived there, the Chancellor family. At the time, it was a woman who was a widow. And she had, I think, 4 daughters and 1 son, and the son was off in the army. So it was just this woman and her 4 daughters living there. Of course, they had slaves, and it was a big sort of plantation house, but the slaves had all run away. And so it was just them living there at the time. And the battle actually takes place around the house. The house is struck by a number of cannonballs, catches on fire, and burns down over the course of the battle. So this is one of the last pictures taken of the Chancellorsville house. The foundation is still there. So you can go to Chancellorsville battlefield and you can find the foundation, and that's kind of cool. Anyway, the other thing you need to know is that the terrain around this location was especially bad. This area was called the Wilderness by the South because it was a bunch of close growth, dense vegetation. There weren't a lot of big trees. Part of that's because there were a lot of iron deposits in the ground here, and so the area had been used for generations as an ironworks or an iron foundry. It had fallen into disuse before the war, but when the war started up, the South had such small industry that it had been started up again. But what that meant was all of the big growth forest had been cut down and used for firewood to smelt the iron. And then when the industry sort of stopped functioning, it all started to grow up again. And so there were all these really close together, thick, small trees, and it was very difficult to move. It was a benefit to Lee because this sort of terrain negates your advantage in numbers. If you can't line up giant formations of men and surround your opponent, and you can't even see your opponent, it's a battle that doesn't necessarily give an advantage to a larger force. Now, Hooker did not expect to fight in the Wilderness. He expected to march on Fredericksburg and catch Lee there, or catch Lee's retreating army somewhere else. But Lee, being tactical as he was, saw this advantage and used it, and marched over to face Hooker's soldiers. So here's sort of the map. Here's the plan. Lee marched along 2 parallel roads, the Plank Road and the Turnpike, and he met Hooker's advancing forces. And there was some stiff fighting in the woods. But Hooker did not expect to be attacked, and this sort of surprised him. And so he retreated his advanced columns back to the Chancellorsville house. And they took up a defensive position, waiting to see what Lee was going to do. Lee didn't really know what he was going to do because he was outnumbered. He had 48,000 men, and Hooker had 80,000 men. And it's especially in a warfare where technology favors the defense, you don't necessarily want to attack against those sorts of odds. And so there was a famous campfire council that night. Jackson and Lee sat on some cracker boxes by a fire, pulled out some maps, and talked well into the night. And ultimately, they made a bold tactical decision. Lee was going to divide his army further. He had a smaller army than the enemy, but he was going to keep 17,000 men with him, and he was going to try and pretend like his whole army was still there. Meanwhile, Jackson was going to take the large part of his army, 33,000 men, and he was going to do a flank march around to the backside of Hooker's army and attack. Catch him entirely by surprise, he hoped. The problem was they didn't have a road that they knew of that could take him around without being seen. But a guy who owned a foundry had just built a new road that wasn't on any maps, and he took Jackson down around that way. And so Jackson found the road and he marched down it. What's particularly interesting, though, is that Lee had to cross an open patch of ground where Jackson had to cross an open patch of ground where the Union army could see him. And there was some shelling and an attack that was led against the final elements of his column. But what Hooker interpreted from this, because the portion of road in which he saw Jackson's forces moving, they were moving south, he interpreted it as Lee retreating. He thought it was a withdrawal, a general withdrawal. So he didn't worry about the possibility of a flanking attack. And Jackson liked to call his troops the foot cavalry because they marched so hard and so fast. And so they were able to march the 12 miles around the position in one day and line up an hour or an hour and a half before sunset. Around 6 o'clock, 5:30, 6 o'clock, they made a flank attack. Now, the guy on the far side of the Union lines was a guy named Howard. Of course, it would be Howard. He had actually, I believe, lost an arm, a forearm, at one of the battles in the Peninsula Campaign, and his corps had never really been fully replenished, and so it was a small corps. They didn't have the best reputation. The other problem was that a lot of his corps was made up of German immigrants, and so they didn't speak English, and so there was a difficulty in communicating from the officers to the men because there was a language barrier. Whatever the case, Jackson lined his guys up, and Howard had no idea he was there. The hot air balloon corps was ineffective at spotting the flank march for two reasons. One, it was an overcast day, and they couldn't go up high enough to see very far because they would go up into the clouds and they wouldn't be able to see anything. And two, the forest was so thick that they couldn't really see through the thick forest canopy. And I guess three, there had been so much rain that there was no dust on the roads. And one of the ways that hot air balloons were so effective at spotting enemy soldiers was when enemy soldiers would march on hot, dry roads, clouds of dust would kick up and they'd be able to see where the armies were marching. And so none of that happened. And Jackson was able to get clear around the Union army and launch this flanking attack on Howard's 9th Corps and just obliterate it. This was a decimation. Like these guys came through the woods totally unexpectedly. The Union soldiers were like sitting around playing cards and having soup, and their guns were stacked in little tripods. And so Jackson came through with his men and just obliterated the 9th Corps. In fact, it rolled up the whole army, and the only reason that it didn't cause a general rout and the ultimate destruction of Hooker's army was probably, I guess, two things. Number one, the terrain was so bad. It was difficult to keep in line, and so the corps all got mixed up with each other as they charged through the wilderness and the terrain. So that they weren't able to stay in line, and parts were too far advanced and parts were too far back, and they were funneling together and they were all mixed up, and so they had to call a halt to sort of reorganize their forces. But secondly, it got dark and they couldn't see anything. But Jackson determined that he was not going to give up his advantage and that he was going to order a night attack to finish off Hooker's army. And so he started forming his guys up for a night attack, and he decided to go out and scout the territory himself. And so he rode through his own lines forward to try and see the enemy and the enemy lines and gain some intelligence of where they were. As he got out there, one of his officers asked him if it was safe for him to be that far forward, and he said, "The enemy is in retreat. I have nothing to fear here." Unfortunately, as he turned around to go back to his own lines, a regiment of North Carolinians saw men on horses, assumed they were Union cavalry, and opened fire. And Jackson was hit 3 times, fell off his horse, ended up severing an artery. It was bad. They had to amputate his arm. Fun fact, though, they buried his arm with its own headstone. You can go see the arm of Stonewall Jackson, which is just hilarious. But he died. He ended up dying a few days later. And that put an end to the night attack. The South couldn't organize without their commander. They called in another famous Southern general by the name of Jeb Stuart, J-E-B Stuart. Those are initials for a very long name. And he was a cadet that served under Lee when he was the head of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He got terrible grades and was a difficult student by all accounts, but he had been a brilliant cavalry officer. What's interesting, he was the highest ranking guy and the guy with the most battle experience, and so they put him in charge, but he was a cavalry officer suddenly in charge of 33,000 infantry soldiers. But he did an admirable job. He was able to organize them all and send communications back and forth with Lee. And he and Lee decided that they would launch a combined attack in the morning. Rather than let Hooker attack them individually, they would try and, pincer his army between them. And they did. However, one of the most important things that happened in the battle was there was this height called Hazel Grove that overlooked down to the Chancellor House, and it was occupied by Union forces, but Hooker was afraid that they had created what's called a salient or a bulge in his line that would be easily attacked from both sides, and so he pulled them back. And the South was able to take that hill and set up their artillery on that hill, and it had a beautiful lane down which they could sight on the Chancellorsville house. This is a picture of it in modern day. Actually, if you go to the Battle of Chancellorsville and you look across the road, you can see Hazel Grove Heights there. It's pretty cool. So this had an immediate result the next day. When Lee and Jeb Stuart launched their attack the next morning, it was some of the bloodiest fighting of the Civil War. The single bloodiest day was Antietam, but if you looked for the single bloodiest morning, it would be Chancellorsville. More people died. I think the average was 5 soldiers died a second over the course of that morning. It's absolutely horrifying. But they launched this very bloody attack, and it started with a shelling of the Chancellor House. And that morning, Hooker was standing on the porch leaning against a pillar, sipping his morning coffee, when a solid shell from one of those cannon hit the pillar, split it in half. The pillar came down right on Hooker's head and knocked him out. He was unconscious. When he woke up, he had a concussion. Check mark for concussions. Nobody knew what a concussion was back then. They said you had your bell rung or the wind knocked out of you or whatever. But he couldn't think. He couldn't issue orders. He didn't know what was going on. He kept falling asleep. All the traditional concussion symptoms, he had them. And he was asked if he would relinquish command, and he refused to relinquish command of the army. So he continued to command the army even though he had a concussion, and he essentially did nothing. When his artillery ran out of ammunition, they came begging him for more ammunition. He famously said, "I can't make ammunition." And so, he did a really terrible job. And ultimately, all that happened was his 80,000 men, remember, against 48,000 men. his 80,000 men ended up in retreat. They formed in sort of like a turtle-like box formation with their back against the river, and ran away from Lee, and Lee was able to rejoin the two vulnerable halves of his army. In fact, there's a famous scene of him riding into the Chancellorsville. You can see the house burning in the background, into the Chancellorsville intersection with his armies all around, cheering him on. And he took stock of the situation and decided that he would not let his advantage go, and that he was going to attack Hooker while he had the chance. And so he started making preparations to attack Hooker's numerically superior dug-in army. We don't know how that would have turned out because the attack never came. One thing Hooker did do was he sent to his second-in-command, Sedgwick, telling him that Lee's army was at Chancellorsville and that nobody was really defending Fredericksburg. And he ordered Sedgwick to attack Fredericksburg, move through Fredericksburg, down the turnpike, and come at Lee. And so Hooker expected Sedgwick to sort of come to his rescue. It's kind of funny because Sedgwick had 28,000 men and Hooker had 80,000, and somehow he expects Sedgwick to rescue him. But obedient, Sedgwick decided to launch the attack. He was able to take Mary's Heights from Early retreated, and then that was called the Second Battle of Fredericksburg. They lost a lot of men taking these heights, as you can imagine. He's marching uphill against a stone wall with a beautiful infilated field of fire, and it was tough. But Sedgwick was able to take those heights, take Fredericksburg, and continue down the road 12 miles to Chancellorsville, same distance that Jackson was able to march in a day. But if you look at this map, you'll see that there's a group of guys with Wilcox written next to them at the top. That was a group of Alabamans, and they did not get attacked by Sedgwick. Sedgwick came up by Mary's Heights and the stone wall. And so Wilcox was sort of left up there on his own. And those Alabama guys ended up marching south to try and meet up with the rest of Early's men. And at a place called Salem Church, wow, this is a terrible graphic. It looked white when I put it in here, but apparently it just makes itself whatever color the screen is. But a place called Salem Church, Wilcox's Alabamans found a hill. They lined up on it, and they decided to try and fight against Sedgwick's troops. Sedgwick had 28,000 men. They had 1,800. And they fought really well, and they fought long enough for Lee to get message that Sedgwick was coming. Lee did some quick math. He said, okay, I have, 4,000 men. He has 2,800 men. And Hooker's got 80,000 men. The guy I need to kill is Sedgwick. And so he decided to march on Sedgwick. And he moved his forces down. There was a big battle at a place called Salem Church between Sedgwick and McLaw's division of Lee's forces. It was a Confederate victory. Sedgwick ended up retreating. You can sort of see the bulge in the river there. He moved into that little bulge in the river and created a defensive position for himself. Lee decided that he would attack Sedgwick, but Sedgwick, I guess intelligently, retreated across the ford back to his side of the Rappahannock, which was covered by artillery, and thereby escaped being attacked by Lee. When Lee turned around to go back for Hooker, Hooker also withdrew. It's kind of a fun story about Hooker and his withdrawal. Apparently, Hooker asked for a vote of his officers to decide what they would do, and his officers decided to stay and attack Lee, and then he overruled them and ran away anyway. At the end of the day, the casualties for this battle were pretty horrific. You're looking at 30,000 dead. Well, not dead, 30,000 casualties. They're not all dead people. Some of them were grievously injured, some were captured, some were MIA, missing in action, presumed dead. 30,000. And the Union had 17,000 casualties, the Confederacy 13,000 casualties, including, of course, Stonewall Jackson, probably the most devastating outcome for the Confederate side. But what I think this battle shows more than anything is the genius of Robert Lee. Yes, he took dangerous risks. Yes, it could have gone badly for him, but he realized that in his current position, the only way to be successful was to take risks. And he did. And with a force that was less than half the size of the enemy force, he launched successful attacks and won a battle ultimately causing more casualties to the enemy than he himself received. And this is all good, but if you're a student of math and you're interested in ratios, you will realize that an army of 130,000 men who takes 17,000 casualties loses a smaller percentage of their total men than an army of 60,000 men who takes 13,000 casualties. So even though it was a strategic victory for Lee, even though his men fought brilliantly, he couldn't sustain this kind of loss, and he knew it. And that is one of the reasons that he decided to invade the North and why we ended up with the Battle of Gettysburg, which we'll talk about at some point in the future. Anyway, this is the battle in which the Red Badge of Courage is set. All of these events hopefully help you picture it. I'll send out maybe a video this week on from PBS or something like that on the Battle of Chancellorsville that'll give you some real live graphics of troop movements and things like that, and hopefully solidify some of this. But we'll get the perspective of a Union soldier, a private, without all the knowledge of generals and maneuvers and things like that on this battle, and I think that's going to be instructive. It's going to help us understand and feel what it's really like to be in one of these battles rather than get this high overhead perspective of everything. As always, if any of you have questions, please do not hesitate to ask. I am more than happy to answer. Thank you for your time and attention, and have a good day.